May the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, our Creator and Redeemer. Amen. I have to say I'm just a little on edge after what happened at 8 o'clock this morning. It was quite dramatic. I just want to say thank you to you all for being here. This is summer, it's a long weekend, it's horribly hot out there. And the readings during the summer, at least in this year, are often quite challenging because they kind of go on a bit. So last week we heard the first bit of the David and Bathsheba story, and this week we've got some more. And we're just starting on a long schedule of John's Gospel talking about Jesus as the bread of life. I think they kind of crammed them all into the summer because they knew there wouldn't be many people here to... That's my sense anyway. I'm not going to be here to preach either, so it doesn't worry me, but good luck, Scott. So I'm going to go back to the David story this morning because I think it's important that we don't ignore it. It's very easy for somebody to preach and just kind of skim over it because it's so difficult, but I'm going to talk about it today. You are the man. With those words, Nathan, very courageous, wise man and prophet, bursts David's bubble and exposes him to his people as human, just like the rest of them. David, considered to be the greatest king that Israel has ever known, handsome, charismatic, brilliant general, attractive to both men and women, poet, shepherd, chosen of God, comes crashing into the moral gutter. From that moment, we're shown the power of the Bible to express insights about our humanity and its relationship to God, which will be healthy and liberating forever. As we heard in last week's first reading, David seduced Bathsheba, the wife of one of his frontline officers, Uriah the Hittite. And on hearing later of her pregnancy, he recalled her husband, offered him some R&R in the presence of his wife, fails to get Uriah to cooperate, and then arranges with Joel, his commanding officer at the front, to have Uriah put in the very front of the battle lines in a suicidal mission where he's bound to be killed. And he is. As Herbert O'Driscoll, Anglican priest, writer and preacher, says, in that searing moment, we see the worst and even the best of us. The story isn't primarily about sexuality, it's primarily about the shadow side of human nature, and it uses sexuality as its focus. It could have used other elements in David and in us. End of quote. Weeks later, Nathan exposes David's guilt in that dramatic and courageous manner that we heard about this morning. He tells David the story of the rich man and the poor man. The rich man has many flocks of sheep and many riches, and the poor man has but one little lamb of which the family is very fond. And the rich man seizes the little lamb from the poor man and butchers it to share with a guest. And David is outraged at the behavior of the rich man and demands revenge against him for his greed and his cruelty, until Nathan says, "You are that man." And then we see contrition and moral greatness kicking in. David, who could have had Nathan eliminated by just lifting his finger, instead bows his head and accepts total responsibility for his actions. Whenever I read that passage, I find myself wondering about Nathan, about the role of the prophet, about who the prophet might be who could speak to one of our current politicians worldwide in that manner that Nathan speaks to David. Who would have the ability to stand up to a Putin or a Trump or a Ford or a Trudeau or any other politician you care to name in the world right now and point out their lack of compassion or their viciousness or their greed or whatever the case may be, and not find themselves eliminated. I don't think we have anybody like that around right now, and we don't have that tradition of prophet which the Old Testament has in spades. And then, after moving on from thinking about politicians, which is always fun, isn't it, these days, I think about who would I listen to? Who has that ability in my life to point out to me my misdemeanors or my lack of generosity or my lack of sensitivity or whatever it is that I'm aware is there, but I hope nobody else notices. It's very bad to be smug or self-congratulatory, even as we think about those politicians that we choose not to like. Is it for you, your spouse? Is it one of your children? Is it a close friend or a spiritual advisor or a mentor that can talk to you like that and point those things out to you? We don't indulge in private confession in the Anglican Church very often, but if we did, what would you or I find to ourselves needing to confess? I think that in this story of the Bible, we're learning the important lesson that it's only when we accept full responsibility for our actions and our decisions, brutally painful and hard though that may be sometimes, that we're free to move on and to leave the burden behind. But to go back to the David story, this is the bit you didn't hear today. Months go by, the child is born. The child sickens for a week, and for a week David lies prostrate, neither eating nor sleeping, wrestling with God and with his deepest self. When the child dies, the household fears that David will be suicidal. But in a scene as sharply imaged as any video, David arises, washes, anoints himself, changes his clothes, and goes to make love to Bathsheba, the wife he has so badly wronged and hurt. There are moments in our lives when we cannot have what we desperately want, and when that in turn makes it necessary for us to face some dying within ourselves. At such a time, we can wallow in our inner dying, like Judas did after he realized the terrible mistake that he had made when he'd handed Jesus over to the authorities. Or we can choose to live again, as Peter did after he had denied Jesus on what became Good Friday. The psalm that we just read together, Psalm 51, will be familiar with, I'm sure, to most of you, because it's one that we use every single Ash Wednesday. And it's a psalm that has been attributed to David that was written after this experience. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. It's something we all say and mean, I think probably several times in our lives. There's much of David in each of us. We see in him a human being scaling the heights, biting the dust, delighting in his own strengths and appalled at his own weaknesses, and so discovering both the implacable laws of accountability, but also the liberating love of God that makes it possible for him and for us to recover our self-worth and to live again. It's no coincidence that Jesus was born into the house of David, that his bloodline comes directly from David's union with Bathsheba through their son Solomon. He too would experience death and resurrection and offer us new teachings and new life through God's grace and compassion. In our gospel today, Jesus told the crowds who pressed upon him and sought yet more signs that he is the sign. He is the sign they've been waiting for. He is and was the bread of life. But that, his kind of bread would mean that they would never be hungry again. He knew that we humans cannot fail to fall short of the mark in our lives. He knew that we are often proud or greedy or envious or angry or lazy or dishonest. And that's bound to disturb our relationships. But I think that what he's promising in those words is that if we stay close to him and his teachings, even when we fail to meet our own standards, he will once again offer us life in all its abundance. But if we stray, that life will quickly ebb away and will be caught up in whatever it is that is taking over our life, so that there's no room for him anymore. And the bread of life will fail to satisfy us. And in the snippet from the letter to the Ephesians that we heard earlier this morning, the writer exhorts his readers to live a life worthy of their calling with all humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. I think those words resonate with us here at St. George's in all kinds of ways. And I think that for all of us who call ourselves Christian, that means staying close to the one who is the bread of life, not only for the people of his day, but for all times and all places. Amen.